morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Digital Hammurabi. I'm your host, Megan Lewis, and today I am very excited to be joined by Emily Smith, who is going to talk to us about all things Hittite. So I'm at least in for an education because I know, peripherally about the Hittites, who they were, what they kind of did, but it will be fantastic to go a little bit more in depth. So Emily, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm always thrilled to have an opportunity to talk Hittites.
I think that they're one of the cultures that don't get as much exposure as they really should. And I always complain that as an Assyriologist that Mesopotamia doesn't get enough playtime when you consider things like Egyptology and the classics. And then Hittites are even a smaller subsection of everyone's attention. So I am very excited about this.
Yeah, they're like the nichest of the niche of the sort of ancient Near East civilizations. So
exactly.
I'm excited for this.
Oh, it's going to be good. Would you please started properly, give a little bit of a background about who you are and how you got into the field? That would be really helpful.
Sure. So my name is Emily Smith. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Chicago in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, where I study primarily Hittite. I'm also a linguist. So I'm doing a joint program between the NELC department and the Linguistics department. And the way that I got into Hittite is a little bit strange. I didn't come from linguistics specifically or classics or any of those sort of adjacent fields that normally bring people into this area of study. In undergrad, I actually majored in fashion design. And
I wanted to do fashion design. Sorry.
Huh?
I wanted to do fashion design as well.
Yeah. So I did fashion design with a double major in French, and then I decided I didn't really like working as a fashion designer, so I went back to grad school, as you do when you don't know what you want to do in your 20s. And so I got my master's in linguistics at the University of Colorado, and then I came to Chicago, and I was initially planning to just do a straight linguistics PhD program, but I took some classes in NELC, which is how I was introduced to my advisor, 🀭Support, who is also a Hittitologist and a linguist. And she looks at how you can apply linguistic methodologies to ancient languages, which is kind of a twist on linguistics, because normally if you're studying a modern language, or you're doing field work or documenting a language, if there's something you're confused about, you can just kind of go ask a native speaker about it. And obviously, we can't do that. And so it kind of, combines history and philology and linguistics and all these things that I'm interested in. So I ended up starting out in NELC as my home department and then adding the joint program in linguistics. And now here I am.
That is really, really cool. So can you, so I come from a bit of a philological background. Could you maybe explain what the difference is between philology and linguistics?
Yeah, I can try to. So philology is the study and analysis of text, right? So textual analysis, and looking at both what the text says and so in the case of Hittite and other cuneiform languages, we often have multiple copies of scripts. The Hittites really, really liked copying certain genres of text. So you'll get multiple recensions. And so part of what you do as a philologist is you try to sort of collate all of those and figure out if you have multiple copies of something, well, this is the original copy, right? And then there were two copies made of that. And we can tell from the different mistakes that were made in those that there were two copies, and then all of these other copies are copies of this one with these mistakes, and all of the other ones are copies of these ones. And then a lot of times you'll get texts that are broken. And so you have to sort of combine multiple copies and restore things. And then you do translation and analysis, and all of that is sort of part of philology. And there is some overlap between philology and linguistics, because a big part of doing a philological analysis is obviously analyzing the language and what the text says. But linguistics developed as a field, sort of looking at, in the beginning, Western Indo-European languages, especially Germanic languages. And so there's a different tradition of scholarship there. There's a different approach in terms of, in linguistics, you don't necessarily just look at a specific language, but you start with a theory about languages, and then you look at how that applies to a language. So there's different terminology, which can be kind of confusing sometimes. But I find that they complement each other really, really well.
They must do. That's fantastic. So having done all of the background stuff, do you want to like dive into Hittite? Because I can't remember the last time I had someone tell me about the Hittites.
Let's do it. Do you want me to just sort of start with like an introduction of
that? Would be really great.
Who and where they were? Okay. Yeah, so the Hittites were a group of people who spoke a language called Hittite, obviously. And they, so the time period that we have a historical record of them, of when they were writing their own language, is the late Bronze Age, so roughly about 1650 to 1180 BCE or so. We have attestations of Hittite and Hurrian names in Assyrian records from a little bit before that. But the actual Hittite written record starts around 1650. And yeah, they lived in central Anatolia. I didn't send you a map or anything, but if you look at like a map of Turkey, the Halys River sort of comes down and like makes a loop through central Anatolia, and the Hittite core land was in that area that is sort of surrounded by the Halys River. And their capital was at a city, a site called Hattusha, which is it's a bit east of Ankara in modern day Turkey, in central Anatolia. And they controlled various extents of the region beyond that at different times. But at its greatest extent, they, in varying degrees, either like under direct control or under vassallships and through treaties, controlled essentially from the Aegean Sea into northern Syria, where they bumped up against what was at the time like the borders of Egypt, where Egypt had extended into Syria. And they spoke Hittite is an Indo-European language. So Indo-European is a language family. It includes most of the languages of modern day Europe, as well as Persian and Iranian languages. Sanskrit is an Indo-European language. English is an Indo-European language. Tocharian, which is another extinct Indo-European language, was spoken in China. So the language family really spread out over a very wide area over time. And Hittite is the earliest Indo-European language that we have an attestation of written down. And from analyzing the Hittite language and comparing it to other Indo-European languages, we can tell that Hittite actually broke off from Indo-European fairly early compared to the other Indo-European languages, because there are features that appear like just in Hittite that aren't in other Indo-European languages. And so when people do comparative linguistics and they try to reconstruct Proto-Indo-European by comparing sound changes in different languages, so you'll take like a word in English and a word in French and a word in German and other languages that are sort of similar, but they'll have some differences, and you can reconstruct what the system of sound changes was to kind of build your way back to Proto-Indo-European. And so comparatively, Hittite, it seems like Hittite kind of split off, and then the rest of Proto-Indo-European kind of continued a bit before it split into the other Indo-European languages. Let's see. What else?
Well, so when we're thinking about the Hittites, what kind of evidence do we have for them? Like I know they crop up in various texts from other people, and obviously there's a whole bunch of archaeological evidence. And
so like I said, the earliest sort of mention of either Hittite or Hurrian people comes from the Old Assyrian colony period. And so this was in so level 1B of the city of Kardash. So the Assyrians had established these trading colonies sort of up into Anatolia. And one of them, that was one of the sort of main hubs of their colony network, was a city called Kardash, now called 𒀭Support, and it's a bit south of the Halys River. And in level 1B, which is the level that's dated to about 1830 to 1700, they find tablets that are written in Assyrian, but they have Hittite or Luwian loanwords and names. And the way that we can tell that they're Hittite or Luwian is because the Anatolian languages were the first Indo-European languages to be introduced into the area. So prior to that, you had Akkadian or Assyrian and Sumerian, and then you had an pre-Hittite indigenous language called Hittite. But once you start seeing Indo-European names and words that can be reconstructed as Indo-European, then that's when you start seeing the first evidence of this group of Hittite and Luwian speakers coming into the area. And Luwian is another Anatolian language that is closely related to Hittite. But Hittite is, we have more text from Hittite, and so Hittite is the one that is the most well understood. So you have the old Assyrian colony period at Kardash, which is also called Nesha, and you see these Hittite and Luwian names. And then the first original Hittite language composition is a text called the Enitta text. And Enitta was a king of Kardash, who is also attested separately in records from the old Assyrian colony period. But the Enitta text is a Hittite language composition, and it talks about how Enitta's father, who was a man named Hitkana, who was the king of Kusar, and he conquered Kardash and then was succeeded to the throne by his son. And interestingly, Enitta actually, he goes on a campaign through Anatolia, and he actually destroys the city of Katusha. Before it was obviously under Hittite control, it was still Hattic at the time. And it's a very interesting text because he goes through Anatolia, and some of the cities, as he approaches them, they open their gates to him and are they surrender essentially. And so those cities he doesn't destroy, but the city of Katusha doesn't do that. And so he comes and he sacks the city, and he puts a curse on it, and he says that he sacks the city and he sows weeds or sows cress where it was. And then he says, if anyone becomes king after me and resettles the city of Katusha, may the storm god of heaven strike him. But then we have the end of the colony period, and we skip ahead about 50 or so years. There's a little bit of a dark period there. And then the next Hittite records we have are from a king named Mashili, which means the man from Katusha. And he refers to himself as the man of Kushara in text. So he doesn't specifically say that he is descended from Enitta, but he traces his lineage back to the same city that Enitta's father, Hitkana, was the king of. But Mashili is now the king in Katusha. So whatever happened sort of in between Enitta sacking Katusha and then Mashili being the king in Katusha, we don't have a specific record of, but
the curse did not work.
It seems that the curse was not very effective, because 50 years later the Hittites are there in Katusha, and so that's the earliest record that we have of them, and their archives. So the main archives are found at Katusha. There's about 30,000 tablets, and they span the entire period during which the Hittites were in control there. So that goes to around 1180 is around the time that the city was destroyed. And this was around the time, as people will probably be familiar, of the sort of the Bronze Age collapse, so-called, and the sea peoples and all of that. but it's not totally clear how the capital was destroyed. It doesn't look like it was really like destroyed in a single event. It seems like there was a period of decline. The Hittites had a lot of internal strife throughout the period of their entire kingdom. Within the royal family, people were always killing their family members to become king. And so it seems like there was a lot of instability. There was some famine. There were records of the Hittites writing to other people to ask them for grain because their grain stores were depleted. And then at some point, it seems to be the case that the royal family sort of packed up some of their stuff and some of their important documents and left and moved sort of southeast in towards like Syria, which is where you see the Neo-Hittite states later. And the capital city just sort of was slowly abandoned. And that is the end of Hittite history as we have it written.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Can I ask, and this is a relationship I always get very confused about. We have Hittites and we have Hurrians.
Yes.
And what are they doing?
Well, sometimes they're fighting and sometimes they're marrying each other. So Hurrian is itself also a very interesting language, even less well understood than Hittite. Mm-hmm. It's not related to Hittite. It's not quite a language isolate. So there's Hurrian, and then there's a language called Urartian, which is related to Hurrian, but is attested later, like in the first millennium, I think. Mm-hmm. And those are the only two languages in that language family that we have a record of. And so the Hurrians were located further east, like sort of into eastern Turkey. And yeah, they were another kind of big power in the ancient Near East. And we start to see around the period of during what's called the Empire period, which is sort of the last, kind of the last phase of Hittite history, starting with a king called Shibulu-Liuma. We start to see more influence of Hurrian into Hittite, just like culturally. Mm-hmm. But yeah, they're not, I mean, linguistically, the languages are not related mm-hmm. or anything like that. They're, yeah, just two different powers who were neighbors and sometimes
fought, sometimes didn't.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to take a brief break and say to everyone that if you have questions for Emily, please put them in the chat and tag Josh at Digital Hammurabi. He is keeping an eye on them. He's going to collate them and then send them over to me. So we will take the questions in like the last 15 minutes of the show. So if you have a question, please do get them in. As ever, super chats do have a priority. So yes, remember, ask your questions or we will end without it and you'll be very, very sad. What kinds of gods did the Hittites worship?
So the Hittites were pretty open in their acceptance of different gods. Hittite religion is not my area of study, but in general, we see, so there's a heavy influence of Hattian. Those were the pre-Hittite people who were in central Anatolia. The areas where we see Hattian linguistic influence in Hittite, like Hattian loanwords, is primarily around religion and cult practice. So there are Hattian gods in the pantheon. There are, so in the Anida text, he refers to a deity that's called our God, and that is with the word 🀭, which is like the Indo-European word for God. So like 🀭 is related to like Zeus, right? So that would be like an Indo-European god. You have the Hattian pantheon, and then there's influence from Hurrian religion. They basically kind of took in gods from wherever. And they address the gods in the languages of like in the gods' languages, right? So like in rituals, when they are talking to, like when they are doing something for a Hattite god, someone will say something in Hattic. And when they're doing something for like, you know, a Palaic deity, they'll speak Palaic, or they'll specify like what language something is supposed to be done in.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah, so the sort of the main gods that come up are the storm god, which is Teshub or Tarhunt. Tarhunt is the Indo-European name, and Teshub is the Hurrian name. And then there's a sun goddess, and those are the ones that sort of get mentioned the most. And then Ishtar comes up in the apology of Mashili III. So he was a king in the Empire period. I'm jumping around through history a little bit here, but he deposed his nephew to become king, as the Hittites liked to do. And he wrote this really interesting document called the Apology, where he basically lays out his case for why he has to do this. And he talks about how he was a devotee of Ishtar from a very young age, and Ishtar sort of took his hand and raised him up, and she wanted him to be king. And so he had to overthrow his nephew, because, you know, if Ishtar wants you to be the king, you have to be the king.
Well, you can't say no to her. It's very bad for your health.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's really a mix. And I'm sure other people could talk about that in much more detail.
Sorry, I appreciate I'm kind of asking a lot of really random questions, and you're like, oh my God, this isn't my field.
That's fine. That's totally fine.
But no, I definitely, we appreciate you taking the time to just give us very general information here. What kinds of relationships did the Hittites have with the other great powers of the area? Because like the time that you think about the Hittites, there are lots of like big empires, big kingdoms, and they do butt heads quite regularly.
Yeah, they do. So the Hittites became what are one of sort of like the great powers. So throughout the Middle East in this period, you have this sort of era of diplomacy, where the kings of like the big sort of polities refer to each other as great king, and then they'll have vassal kings who are just king, not great king. And so the Hittites, like I said, they had some issues with Egypt at times, because Egypt had expanded north into what's now Syria, and the Hittites had expanded southeast into what's now Syria. And so they had some disputes at different times. One of them was over a son of the king 🀭, who I mentioned before. So 🀭 had several sons, and while he was on campaign at one point during his reign, and he received a letter from an Egyptian queen who was the widow of most likely Tutankhamun. And she wrote to him and said, you know, my husband died, and she needed to marry someone else, and she didn't want to marry someone from her court. And so she writes to 🀭 and asks him to send one of her sons from Hatti for her to marry, which is sort of an unprecedented thing. And so at first he's very skeptical, and he sends some messengers back, and she writes back to him and says, like, no, this is serious. And so he sends his son, Sandana, but his son is killed on the way by conspirators within the Egyptian court, which 🀭 is very upset about. This is written about in his historical annals, which his son Mashili dictated. And so this leads 🀭 to then make raids into Egyptian territory and bring back Egyptian prisoners. And in the course of doing that, they also unfortunately bring back a plague, which then runs rampant through all of Hatti for like 20 years and ends up killing both 🀭 and his first successor, his son Arnawanda. And then you get Arnawanda's younger brother, Mashili, II ends up becoming king after his father and his brother both die within a year or two of each other. And then Mashili is his own whole fascinating story. But yeah, they were on the same stage. Their main, within their own kingdom, they had a lot of trouble with sort of the western part of Anatolia, just in terms of like they could never seem to really like exert control over it securely for long periods of time. They were always kind of having to go back and like resubjugate people. And then their other main border would have been with Egypt.
Fantastic. It's a little bit like a soap opera. I love this period of history when you look at all the letters and the interactions between all of the kings.
So
it's
like a soap opera. There's this great there's the whole story of Mashili is like a soap opera. Mashili II, he becomes king at a young age. He wasn't supposed to be king. His older brother was. His older brother dies. You know, there's immediately rebellions because he's young. He says he was a child. He was probably in his late teens. So he immediately has to go on a campaign to sort of re-subjugate all the people who had sworn loyalty to his father and his brother. He has an evil stepmother who he thinks murdered his wife. Wow. He's very depressed his whole life. You know, he inherits this kingdom that's still going through this plague that continues through a big part of his reign. So we have all these prayers from him where he's, you know, talking to the gods about how, you know, why are you doing this? Like, how have I upset you? And he goes back through the historical records and looks back through like generations to try to find
what they did.
Yeah. And he finds some things that he thinks his father did. So his father violated some treaties. So he tries to make reparations for that. And then he writes these prayers to the gods about how, like, you know, that wasn't me, that was my father. Should like the sins of my father be inflicted on me? And it's very dramatic and sort of, he's sort of a tragic figure in some ways. But yeah, it's fascinating. I kind of wish somebody would make like one of those like HBO series,
yes,
kind of like Rome, but about the Hittites. There's so much material there. It would be an amazing show. So
like one of the old sword and sandal epics, except in Anatolia instead of like Rome or Greece. That would be that would be amazing. I really think Hollywood and the major TV networks are missing so much material.
Yeah, Hollywood, call me.
See, we have an expert right here. She will help you. So you are looking specifically at the linguistic side of things. Do you want to talk a little bit about that before we get on to audience questions?
Sure. So Hittite is one of the Anatolian languages. So the Anatolian languages are kind of a sub-branch of Proto-Indo-European or Indo-European that split off from Proto-Indo-European sometime around 5000 or 4000 BC, according to the most commonly accepted theory. And they migrated from what's generally taken to be the Indo-European homeland, which is sort of in the Pontic steppes, down into Anatolia in one or several waves. So there's, it's not clear if they kind of came in as one group and then split into different groups that then became the speakers of the different Anatolian languages, or if they sort of migrated in separate groups. But the main, like most attested languages are Hittite and Hurrian, which were both spoken in the 2nd millennium. And then Hurrian continues into the 1st millennium. And then so Hittite was written in cuneiform. Let me say that first. And Hurrian was written sometimes in cuneiform, but more commonly in Hurrian hieroglyphs, which are their own sort of writing system. They're not related to Egyptian hieroglyphs or to cuneiform. They're just a completely separate writing system. And then a little bit later in the 1st millennium, you have some fairly sparsely attested other Anatolian languages, so Lydian, Lycian, Carian, Sidetic, and I'm forgetting one, but they were written in variants of the Greek script. And they're primarily attested in like mortuary settings, so on mausoleums and things like that. And so those texts, they tend to be like pretty short and pretty formulaic. So we just don't really have a whole lot of variety of grammar and lexicon preserved in those contexts. So those are just not as well understood. And
we know what they're there, but that's kind of...
Yes, we know they exist. And you can read like the mausoleum inscriptions and things, but a lot of them are, you know, so-and-so son of so-and-so from this city. And, you know, it's a lot of family terms and things like that. Yeah, and so Hittite is, as I've said a few times, it's the oldest attested Indo-European language. And one thing that's interesting about Hittite in terms of how it sort of fit into the study of Indo-European languages has to do with something called the laryngeal theory, which I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but
I have not.
Okay, so laryngeal describes like a class of sounds or phonemes that are made kind of like in the back of your throat by constricting your larynx. And prior to the discovery of Hittite, which was deciphered in 1915, when linguists were looking at other Indo-European languages and they were trying to reconstruct Proto-Indo-European, they ran into some trouble in terms of figuring out what the sound correspondences were, because they would find, for example, places where you would have like long vowels in places where they couldn't account for them in terms of how they reconstruct things. And so a linguist named Ferdinand de Saussure was the first to propose this theory that there had been some kind of consonant in Proto-Indo-European, and he didn't specify exactly what it was, but basically there was a sound in Proto-Indo-European that didn't survive in any of the existing Indo-European languages, but wherever this sound had been, it had colored the effect of the vowels around it. And so when that sound was lost in all of the Indo-European languages, the quality of the vowels changed. And that was the only way that you could systematically explain the different vowel qualities in all of these languages. And so it was an interesting theory, but it was very hypothetical because he was arguing for the existence of something based on how it affected other things, but the thing itself wasn't there anymore. And then Hittite was deciphered, and Hittite has laryngeals in exactly the places where Saussure theory had predicted that there would be this consonant that he didn't know the nature of that would create. So just to give one example that I was reading about. So the Latin word pasco with a long A for protect, right? That long A is a long A because there used to be a laryngeal after it. And so in Hittite, the word is pachti, so short A plus a laryngeal. So that's kind of how it works. And yeah, so deciphering Hittite and finding that just sort of reinforced this theory that people had been skeptical of for years, which is just one of the ways that Hittite is important linguistically. Yeah, I mean, other than that, it's an interesting language. It goes through some not weird, I shouldn't say that, but it goes through quite a lot of change during the period that it's written down. So it's really interesting to do like a diachronic study of, if you compare like the old Hittite text to the new Hittite text. There's a lot of significant shifts that happen in the language, which, you know, just from a like linguistic perspective, is really interesting to look at. Yeah, and this might be skipping ahead a little bit, but I saw in the chat to the side, one of the first questions, is it true that the Hittite word for water is water? And yes, it's watar. And that's actually was key to deciphering Hittite. So the first sentence of Hittite that was deciphered was two sentences, and it was Nu ninda an etateni watarma ekuteni. And so when they were deciphering this, the ninda is a sumerogram, so they knew that meant bread. And they looked at watar and were like, that looks a lot like water. And then the verb etzateni looks a lot like eat. And so they tentatively translated, you will eat bread and drink water. And then once they figured out it was an Indo-European language, it was a lot easier to decipher the rest. So
that's really, really, really cool.
Yeah.
And this is a really geeky question. Is Hittite cuneiform very similar to like Akkadian and Babylonian cuneiform, or are there distinctions?
So there are some distinctions. There's let me think. The way that it's thought that writing of Hittite was sort of introduced was via scribes from like northern Syria. So it's closest to that ductus.
No, sorry. And again, I'm like, I haven't sent Emily questions ahead of time. I'm just peppering her with whatever comes into my brain. So
that's totally fine. But I did see on your calendar that you're having Mark Whedon on in a couple weeks.
Yes.
Ask him that.
I will ask him
watching. That will be fascinating.
I'll remember that one. Okay, we are going to take a very brief break because I don't have any more questions to ambush Emily with. Josh thinks I should ask you what the meaning of life is. We're not going to do that because I think that is just a little unfair. So we're going to have a very brief break. If you have questions for Emily, now is the last opportunity to get them in. After the break, we will not be taking any more questions. So enjoy yourselves. We will be back in a grand total of 60 seconds. If you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. And hello again, we're back. I'm going to quickly run through some of these super chats we had. Thank you everybody for your time, your questions and your support. We greatly appreciate it. We had a selection of stickers, Conan Lee, Maya Atkinson and Jessica 44. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I can't see what the stickers are, but I'm sure they were amazing. And Ben Lamoureux asks, are the Hittites or Luwians responsible for the spread of the 𝑒os motif in ancient Near Eastern mythology?
I am not sure what the 𝑒os motif is. Let's see.
Ben, if you can send a clarification.
Culture, hero, deity with a chaos monster. I am not sure.
Maybe.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've never
Let's go with
never
maybe.
heard of that. Could be. We'll take credit for it. No,
quite possibly. Let's say yes. Fran Wilson asks, what was the status of women?
That's a good question. We don't really have a lot of textual evidence about the lives of people, like the common people. So there are two sort of interesting things that I can say. The first is that, at least in the Empire period, when a woman married a Hittite king and she became the queen, she had this title of Tawanana. And after her husband died, she retained the title of Tawanana until her own death. So if her husband died and then the son became king, his wife would not become the Tawanana immediately. Okay. The mother would retain that title. And some of the Hittite queens did seem to do a lot of political machinating kind of on their own. So 🀭 was the wife of Mashili III, and seems to have taken on a lot of responsibility around the palace in terms of like the raising of the children and things like that. But she had her own separate correspondence with Ramses of Egypt.
Really?
So yeah, she would write to him and he would correspond with her about political matters in addition to corresponding with her husband. So I don't really know what I don't think we have a whole lot of textual evidence for what the lives of the everyday women were like.
Yeah.
But the queens seemed to be able to exercise a deal of political autonomy if they wanted to.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Myth Vision podcast says, thank you, Megan and Emily, for your dedication and research. I'm late to the party and don't want to ask something that may have already been asked. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your comment. Ben Lamoureux again. Is there any insight on why Mashili attacked Babylon when it was so far away and he apparently wasn't equipped to either govern or annex it?
We're not sure. So this is, he's asking about Mashili the First. So he was a king. The Hittites reused throne names a lot. And so Mashili the First was a king during the Old Kingdom period. He was actually the king right after Hattushili, who was the one who we first have a record of in Hattusha. And he took an army all the way to Babylon, sacked the city, and then just turned around and went back to Hattusha and didn't do anything else. He was murdered not too long after that. So I suppose it's possible that he had additional plans for doing something in that area and didn't get around to it or didn't have time to do it. But yeah, we don't really know. It might have been just to sort of, this was at a time that the Hittites were sort of trying to expand their area of influence and power. It might have just been kind of a power play to show that he could do it. Yeah, I don't think he left any record of like what his reason or motivation was for that, besides to say that he had done it.
Thank you. Koto Mark says, what's with the Hittite pantheon and cult? What is with that?
Well, as I said, the Hittites, the sort of primary gods that come up in their text a lot are the storm god and the sun goddess. Beyond that, their pantheon included gods or deities from a variety of different cultures. Their rituals are really interesting. They, are a little different. They have, one of my favorites is they have a ritual for domestic quarrels. So if like a couple or family members are arguing, someone will come and do this ritual. And the ritual takes several days to complete, and it involves all kinds of magic of different things. It involves a lot of animals. It seems like it would be a very time-consuming and expensive ritual to complete. But when you look at how often Hittite kings were killed by their family members, you can sort of understand why they might have found it very important to really be sure that they were, magically putting quarrels to rest.
Very nice. Leighton Dawson asks, what fraction of the 30,000 tablets have been translated and what are their contents?
Okay.
All of them, Emily, please, if you wouldn't mind.
No, not enough have been translated, I would say. The contents are very wide ranging. The archive at Hattusha seems to have covered a very wide array of genres. I don't know in terms of a percentage how many of those have been published and translated. Some of them are fragments that are very small. Some of them are more complete, but they have everything from, they have myths, prayers, rituals, and festivals. They have letters, they have treaties, they have texts about horses, they have omen texts. It really runs a gamut of all kinds of things, from like, what you would call, say, literature, to religious practice, to like legal texts, there's the laws, of course, to correspondence. Yeah, and so we have a really wide variety of different kinds of things to look at, which is nice. There are, the Hattusha archives are the main ones. There have been some archives found at a few other sites, but those have not really been published very extensively yet, which is unfortunate.
It's kind of the story, I think, with many cuneiform cultures. How much has been published? Well, not enough is what we're saying.
Well, there's a limited number of people who can publish.
Yes,
so,
yes. And you're right. So much of what we have is deeply fragmentary. And if you've got like 500 shards with that much text, we should translate it, but other people are maybe working on more complete tablets instead. Mythology, I showed up late but heard a bit about the Hittite Plague. What was the Egyptian involved with that plague? What was the involvement of the Egyptians with that plague?
So that was the plague that started during the time of 🀭. So 🀭's son had gone to Egypt to marry the widow of King Tut, had been murdered. 🀭 was very upset about this. He raided into Egyptian territory in Syria, took back hostages. They would take people back and like resettle them in the Hittite land. And when they came back, they brought back a plague with them. Not clear exactly what it was, but it lasted for about 20 years. So it wasn't, I mean, the Egyptians weren't directly involved with it. It was just sort of an unfortunate consequence of them making these military raids and bringing people back. And when you're transporting, large groups of people and animals over long distances, you're going to have disease, especially in the Bronze Age, and you're going to bring that back with you. And in this case, they brought back some sort of plague that killed 🀭 and his son and a lot of other people for a very long time.
Thank you. I'm not going to try and pronounce this name. I'm very sorry. Did Hittites split off even before Indo-Iranian?
Yes, it did. I don't know how much before, but Hittite, of all the Indo-European languages that we know about from a written record, Hittite split off the earliest.
Thank you. Tim Smith asks, how long did it take for the peace agreement between the Hittite and Egyptian leaders to be agreed upon?
I don't know how long the actual treaty itself took. So after 🀭's incursions into Egypt, there was increased tension between the Egyptians and the Hittites for a while that culminated in the Battle of Kardash, which was fought by Mashili's son, 🀭. And then about some years after that, maybe 15 years earlier or so, or I'm sorry, 15 years later, there was a peace treaty signed between the Hittites and the Egyptians. It's the first known record of a peace treaty. It's actually, there's a copy of it on display at the United Nations. So, I mean, the entire, if you start from the time of 🀭, then you have Arnuwanda, briefly king before he dies of the plague, then Mashili, 🀭, and then it's Hattusili III who ultimately signs the treaty. So that's a period of over 100 years in total. That's 4 generations, I think. But in terms of like how long they were actually like agreeing on terms or something like that, we don't really know. We just have the final document.
Thank you. And related to that, Fran Wilson asks, how Pyrrhic was the victory at Kardash?
This is a contentious question. So the Battle of Kardash is interesting. It was fought between Hittite and Egyptian forces, and there's actually an entire debate about it. between two professors from the OI, Robert Rittner, who's an Egyptologist, and Theo Vandenhout, who's a Hittitologist, about who won the Battle of Kardash. And if it's okay for me to plug another YouTube channel, you can watch that on the Oriental Institute YouTube channel. They have a video of it. It's an excellent video. Ultimately, they fought this big battle and then not much changed afterwards in terms of who had control of what territory. The Egyptians make a very big deal out of it. There's like a whole big, not a monument specific to that, I think, but they talk about it a lot and claim to have won. The Hittites don't really mention it that much after it happens. They're just kind of like, we fought this battle and then we still controlled this area and they still controlled that area. And, you know, that was that. So yeah, I guess it depends on which source you believe more.
Thank you. And our final question, Flamingo Queen, which is a fantastic name. How certain are we that the Hittites mentioned in the Bible are the same people that we call Hittites?
This is a good question. This is one of the things that when I tell people I study the Hittites, if they recognize the name Hittite at all, it's from the Bible. And there are a couple of different sort of takes on this. The one that I'm not a biblical scholar. I actually am not that familiar with the attestations of the Hittites in the Bible, but Trevor Bryce, who is a Hittitologist, and he wrote one of the main history books of the Hittite Empire. What he proposes is that there are actually two different types of references to the Hittites in the Bible, that there are references to what would have been the Neo-Hittite states that sort of formed in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria after the fall of the Hittite Empire. And then there are other references to the sons of Het or something along those lines that he thinks are just an unrelated group of people that happen to coincidentally have a similar name. So some of the references to the Hittites in the Bible are referencing the Neo-Hittite states, and then some of them are just other people whose names have the same set of consonants in them.
Excellent, thank you. We are about done. That's everyone's questions. Emily, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. I'm, like I said, always happy to talk Hittite.
That's why I like getting people on here. They're like, this is my thing. Yeah. This is what I do. To the audience, if you are interested, Josh's newest publication, which is looking at scribal education and ritual lamenting in Mesopotamia, two topics that, believe it or not, we did make a coherent whole, is now available to pre-order in Kindle. The print version should be available by Friday. He has, I think, the link that he's been putting in the comments. So if you're interested, take a look at that. And we will be back. Let me see when our next one. There we go. We will be back on the 31st of October to talk to Dr. Mark Whedon about more Hittites, because this is just month of Hittites, because like I said, they don't get enough attention. And that is something we are trying to fix. Emily, thank you again. Everybody who was watching, thank you for your questions. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.